cold March evening in 47. A scream ripped across the Virginia countryside that was so unnatural it silenced the fields of Cumberland County. It wasn't an animal's death cry or the wail of a woman in labor, but something so raw and unfamiliar, it chilled the blood of everyone who heard it. Days later, sealed court documents would reveal the horror behind that sound. 13 members of the Piton family were discovered inside their plantation home, dismembered and laid out with a precision that baffled investigators. The sheriff's report, hidden away for more than a century, described cuts so exact they looked like the work of a surgeon, not a killer. The only suspect, a slave known only as Isaac, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind evidence that made even the most seasoned lawmen question what they thought they knew about slavery and power in the antebellum South. Before we continue into Isaac's story and the shadow it cast over the Piton plantation, remember that this channel exists to pull back the curtain on the parts of American history most textbooks never dared to print. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and tap the notification bell, and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from, because these forgotten tales stretch farther than most realize. What happened at Piton Grove forced authorities to rethink everything about the relationship between master and slave in Virginia. The truth of that March night was buried deep in courthouse vaults until long after the Civil War, but the memory of it still haunts Cumberland County. In the spring of 1847, the land itself was a contradiction. Rolling green, tobacco fields promised wealth and stability, while the human cost of that prosperity was hidden in plain sight. The James River, winding through the countryside, carried both commerce and secrets. Piton Grove was one of the largest estates in the county, nearly 2,000 acres of fertile soil lying 15 miles southwest of the courthouse. Built in the 1760s by Josiah Piton, its imposing three-story mansion stood on a rise overlooking the land, its white columns and wide porches a proud display of wealth drawn from tobacco and the lives of the enslaved. By 1847, Josiah's grandson Cornelius was master of the house. He was a man of sharp eyes and strict habits who kept tight control over every aspect of plantation life rather than delegating to overseers. His wife Margaret, raised among Richmond's elite banking families, lived with him at the estate along with their 4 children, Samuel, Elizabeth, Thomas, and young Mary. Also in the house were Cornelius's aging mother, Prudence, still sharp at 78, and Margaret's unmarried sister Catherine, who had moved in after their father's passing. Completing the household was Cornelius's younger brother, Dr. Jonathan Pemberton, a Philadelphia-trained physician who often stayed at the plantation when treating patients in the countryside. Together, they represented wealth, influence, and the image of Southern gentility. But within weeks, that image would be shattered in a way that no one in Virginia would ever forget. What made the Piton plantation stand out was not only its sweeping acreage or the profits it produced, but the unusual composition of its enslaved workforce. Cornelius had inherited 43 enslaved people from his family. Yet over the years he added more in ways that puzzled his neighbors. Instead of buying through the busy slave markets in Richmond or Norfolk, Cornelius developed a strange reputation for seeking out men and women who other planners had written off as troublesome or impossible to control. It was this peculiar practice that brought Isaac to Piton Grove in the fall of 1844. Isaac had come from Prince Edward County, where he had been forced to labor in a slaughterhouse. His former owner, Fielding Crawford, described him in letters as a growing problem and pressed to sell him quickly. Isaac was a striking figure, towering over 6 feet tall, with massive shoulders and hands so large they drew comment on their own. His pale gray eyes gave him a piercing, almost ghostly stare that made overseers uneasy. He spoke sparingly, preferring gestures and silence, though those who worked near him realized quickly that his quietness came from watchfulness rather than ignorance. What set Isaac apart, and what made him both valuable and feared was his mastery of the blade. He could butcher a hog in half the usual time with such efficiency that no cut was wasted. His understanding of anatomy bordered on uncanny. He knew the precise joints to sever, how to extract organs without damage, and the best methods to preserve meat so that nothing spoiled. On the surface, these skills made him indispensable. Beneath the surface, however, they only deepened the unease around him. The reasons Crawford wanted him gone were never officially recorded, but rumors filled the silence. Whispers told of animals slaughtered with unsettling brutality, their remains arranged in strange patterns that served no practical purpose. There were tales of Isaac being caught standing silently over butchered carcasses, his clothes eerily spotless, as if he had discovered a way to spill no blood, even in the messiest of tasks. Cornelius Peyton saw an opportunity. Crawford was so eager to part with Isaac that he sold him for nearly 30% below market value, with only one condition: Isaac was never to be resold to anyone in Prince Edward County. Cornelius considered it a bargain. For nearly 3 years, Isaac lived at Peyton Grove without incident. Cornelius put him in charge of slaughtering and preserving the estate's livestock, a responsibility Isaac handled with the same unsettling precision that had defined his past. He preferred to work in isolation, which suited him well, and a separate building about 200 yards from the main house was designated for his use. There alone with his knives and carcasses, Isaac quietly carried out the tasks that would one day make his name infamous. The slaughterhouse at Peyton Grove was a fortress of brick and mortar built with thick walls and narrow windows to keep the heat at bay during Virginia's sweltering summers. Inside, everything bore the mark of Isaac's unnerving discipline. His knives hung in perfect order along the walls, from small paring blades to heavy cleavers, each one sharpened and polished to a gleam. Sharpening stones sat evenly spaced along a bench, and the entire space was spotless, a fact that unsettled visitors who wondered how a man could butcher animals daily and leave behind no trace of blood. March 15th, 1847, began like countless other mornings on the plantation. The air smelled of tilled earth and young tobacco seedlings, promising another season of prosperity. In the garden, Margaret Peyton supervised the preparation of vegetable beds, while the children recited lessons to their tutor, Professor Aldrich, who had traveled from Richmond. Cornelius, in his study, reviewed ledgers that confirmed what he already believed: 1847 would be the most profitable year in Peyton Grove's history. The plantation thrived, the numbers soared, and everything seemed to point toward fortune. The first to sense something was wrong was Dr. Jonathan Peyton. He had arrived the evening before to treat several enslaved workers who showed signs of influenza. As he often did, he planned to check on them again before departing. But when he walked toward the quarters just past noon, the silence struck him as unusual. He expected coughing or murmured voices, but instead there was nothing. At first he assumed the patients were resting under the watch of old Bessie, the plantation's midwife and healer. Then he noticed a different scent in the air, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. The doctor's gaze fell on Isaac's cabin. Its door, normally shut tight, hung open, creaking in the breeze. Even more disturbing were the stains on the threshold, dark and uneven, the unmistakable color of dried blood. Jonathan's stomach tightened. His years of medical training had shown him every shade of blood stain imaginable, and these patterns did not suggest an accident or a simple wound. They spoke of something deliberate, something violent. With his pulse rising, he pushed the door wide and stepped into the dim interior. At first glance, the room looked oddly meticulous. Isaac's meager belongings, clothes, a cot, a few tools were arranged with unnatural precision, almost like exhibits in a display. But it was the rafters that forced Jonathan backward in shock. Hanging from ropes cut and tied with mathematical care were shapes that at first seemed like butchered hogs or beef sides. Yet as the doctor's eyes adjusted to the light, his horror deepened. These were not animals. The proportions, the skin, the joints, they were unmistakably human. Jonathan's hands trembled violently as he tried to steady himself. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet his training forced him to examine what he saw. The cuts were too clean, too intentional. Joints separated flawlessly, organs removed with practiced ease. This was not random carnage, it was dissection. What chilled him most was not just the presence of human remains, but the way they had been prepared, displayed almost clinically, as though Isaac's cabin had become less a dwelling and more a grotesque laboratory. There were no signs of panic, no overturned furniture, no desperate last moments of resistance. The cuts were too exact, too deliberate, as though the victims had been approached not with rage, but with the clinical calm of a butcher at his trade. Jonathan Peaton could hardly keep his footing as he staggered back from Isaac's cabin toward the main house, his mind unable to reconcile what he had seen. On the way, other details emerged that deepened his dread. The plantation grounds were still. No clatter from the fields, no chatter of children, no smoke from cooking fires, only a silence that pressed down like a weight. At the house, the front door gaped open, something Margaret Peaton would never have allowed. Jonathan's calls went unanswered as he stepped inside, moving through rooms that looked frozen in time. The dining table was neatly set for the midday meal, food cooling untouched on fine china. In the parlor, Margaret's embroidery rested on her chair, the trailing thread still caught in the needle. It was as if life had been interrupted mid-motion. At the foot of the staircase, Jonathan stopped cold. Dark stains marred the carpet leading upward in a dragging pattern. His heart pounded as he followed the trail to the second floor, bracing himself for whatever he might find. In Cornelius's study, the horror revealed itself fully. Cornelius sat upright in his leather chair, hands resting naturally as if he had been writing in his ledger. But his head had been removed with chilling precision and placed neatly on the desk in front of him like a grotesque ornament. Nothing in the room was disturbed, no papers scattered, no signs of a fight. Only the impossible sight of his brother's lifeless body, posed with unsettling care. The rest of the family had been arranged with the same cold artistry. Margaret was discovered in the bedroom, her body posed as though she were arranging flowers, her head placed delicately among the bouquet. The children were found in the nursery, seated in a circle on the floor, as if at play, their heads carefully positioned in the center, turned inward as though sharing some final conversation. On the back porch, old Prudence rocked silently in her chair, her head resting neatly on a side table beside her Bible and spectacles. Catherine was in the kitchen, her body poised at the counter where she had been making bread, her head set squarely on the cutting board. What unnerved Jonathan most of all was the absence of blood. There were no splashes on the walls, no pools staining the floors. It was as if the killings had been carried out elsewhere, and the bodies returned to create these nightmarish scenes. Examining the victims more closely, Jonathan's physician's eye noted the identical cuts on each neck, clean, precise, and made with instruments sharper than any farm tool. Each wound suggested a single fatal stroke delivered from behind. None of the victims bore defensive wounds. None had even known they were in danger. When Sheriff Thomas Hawthorne arrived the next morning with 2 deputies and the county coroner answering Jonathan's desperate midnight plea, they entered a house that felt less like a crime scene than a carefully staged display. What they saw would test not only their courage, but the limits of their understanding of human cruelty. What Sheriff Hawthorne and his men uncovered inside Peaton Grove defied every expectation they had built over years of dealing with violence. The sheriff was no stranger to bloodshed. He had seen killings born of jealousy, robberies gone wrong, and uprisings put down with brutal efficiency. But nothing in his 20 years of service prepared him for what lay before him. His first question was simple, yet impossible. How could a single individual kill 13 people without raising so much as a cry for help. There was no forced entry, no splintered locks or broken windows. Whoever had entered the house had either been welcomed or had possessed keys to the doors. Equally baffling was the lack of blood. The bodies had been moved and positioned in scenes of domestic normalcy. Yet there were no stains, no drag marks, no pools of fluid where they should have been. When coroner William Fitzgerald conducted his first examinations, his findings only deepened the mystery. Every victim had died from a single clean slice to the neck, severing both carotid arteries and the jugular vein with the precision of a surgeon. The instrument had to have been razor sharp and guided by someone with expert knowledge of anatomy. But even more unsettling was the state of the remains. Though they had been dead for half a day, the skin retained its color and warmth, and the usual signs of blood pooling and early decomposition were absent. It was as if the bodies had been drained completely, leaving them preserved in a grotesque state of suspension. Suspicion fell quickly on the enslaved population, a predictable reflex in a world where violence against slaveholders was one of the deepest fears of the planter class. Alongside Isaac, 3 others were missing: Moses, a field hand in his 30s, Sarah, who worked in the kitchen, and Peter, a youth who often assisted Isaac in the slaughterhouse. But that theory collapsed when the search of the quarters revealed their fates. Moses was discovered in his cabin, posed as though asleep. Sarah's body was in the kitchen garden, arranged as if she were tending the vegetables. Peter was found in the slaughterhouse, his posture suggesting he had been cleaning tools. Each, like the Peton family, had been decapitated with chilling precision, their heads placed with the same deliberate care. With these discoveries, the investigators were forced to abandon the idea of a slave revolt or act of revenge. Instead, the evidence pointed back to Isaac alone. His cabin, already a site of horror, yielded even darker secrets upon closer inspection. Beneath loose floorboards, the sheriff's men uncovered a cache of journals, written in a careful, educated script that no one expected from a man they assumed illiterate. The entries stretched back nearly 3 years and read less like the thoughts of a laborer and more like the meticulous notes of a scientist. Page after page cataloged the lives of Peton Grove's inhabitants. Every movement, every habit, every fear and weakness had been recorded with cold precision. He noted what time Cornelius retired to his study, when Margaret liked to work on her embroidery, which games the children played in the nursery, even the ailments and vulnerabilities of the elderly and infirm. The journals revealed not only planning, but obsession, a calculated study of how to dismantle an entire household without resistance. For Sheriff Hawthorne and his men, the discovery of those journals turned Isaac from a fugitive laborer into something far more terrifying. A figure who had transformed the tools of butchery and the discipline of observation into a methodical campaign of slaughter. And with Isaac still unaccounted for, the terror of Peton Grove was only beginning. The journals, written in a precise and deliberate hand, revealed far more than idle musings. They showed months, perhaps years, of methodical preparation. Sheriff Hawthorne, though not a scholar himself, quickly recognized the weight of what he held. To make sense of it, he summoned Professor Marcus Aldrich, the Peton children's tutor, who had escaped the massacre only by chance. As Aldrich translated and studied the entries, the portrait of Isaac that emerged defied every assumption the community had made about him. The earliest notes, dating back to October 1844, soon after Isaac's arrival at Peton Grove, appeared at first almost harmless lists of routines, the daily comings and goings of both the family and the enslaved sketches of the plantation grounds. Yet even these early pages carried a cold, analytical tone, more like the field notes of a scientist than the diary of a laborer. Isaac was not simply recording, he was studying. By late 1844, the writings began to shift from observation to experimentation. Isaac tested small disruptions in household routines and documented the results. In one entry, he described moving Margaret Peaton's prized vase a few inches on the mantel, noting with interest her subtle agitation when she noticed but could not explain why. By early 1845, he was charting sleeping patterns throughout the house, identifying which floorboards creaked under pressure and which doors could be opened silently. He cataloged the rhythms of the night with unnerving patience until he knew the household's every vulnerability. The journals contained more than behavioral notes. Interspersed were drawings of startling precision, anatomical illustrations detailing skeletal structures, musculature, and organ systems. These were not crude sketches, but the kind of renderings one might expect in a medical text. The sophistication of the work raised troubling questions. How had an enslaved man in antebellum Virginia acquired knowledge surpassing that of many trained physicians? Professor Aldrich's investigation into Isaac's origins only deepened the mystery. Fielding Crawford had claimed Isaac was born on his plantation, yet no record of his birth or baptism existed. Elderly enslaved residents who had lived their entire lives on Crawford's land swore they had never seen Isaac before 1842. It was as if he had appeared suddenly, without history or roots. Inquiries in Prince Edward County led Aldrich to Dr. Samuel Hutchinson, a physician who had once treated Crawford's enslaved population. Hutchinson remembered Isaac vividly, not just for his imposing presence, but for his unsettling aptitude. Isaac, he explained, had assisted during medical emergencies involving both humans and livestock, displaying an understanding of anatomy that rivaled trained surgeons. His hands, Hutchinson said, were steady to the point of inhuman, his knife strokes flawless. Yet what disturbed the doctor most was Isaac's demeanor. Where others might flinch or show compassion, Isaac remained utterly detached. He watched suffering with the same calm interest he gave to dissection, as though pain were irrelevant beside the knowledge it revealed. Hutchinson admitted Isaac's skill had saved lives more than once, but he also confessed that the man's presence had grown intolerable. It was not simply the proficiency, it was the absence of humanity that clung to him like a shadow. By the time Aldrich set down his translations, the journals painted a picture not of a laborer or even a runaway, but of a mind quietly calculating testing and preparing. Isaac's past was already a puzzle with missing pieces. Now it appeared those gaps might conceal something far darker than anyone at Peaton Grove could have imagined. The deeper Sheriff Hawthorne's inquiry went, the clearer it became that Isaac's history was far darker than anyone had realized. What had first been presented as a simple sale, Crawford passing off a troublesome worker to Cornelius Peaton at a discount, was in fact a desperate attempt to rid himself of a growing danger. Local records showed that in the months before Isaac left Crawford's plantation, 3 enslaved people had died suddenly and without explanation. Officially, their deaths were blamed on illness, but the truth was buried in the private notes of Dr. Samuel Hutchinson. Hutchinson, who had examined the bodies, recorded his suspicion that the deaths were anything but natural. Each victim bore a nearly invisible puncture wound just behind the left ear. With his medical training, Hutchinson recognized the wound as the work of a thin, sharp instrument inserted with surgical precision, striking the brain stem and causing instant, silent death. The discovery unsettled him deeply. He had shared his concerns with Crawford, but the planter, wary of scandal and disruption, chose silence. Within weeks, Isaac was sold at a steep discount, bundled off to Peaton Grove, as though the transaction could erase the danger. The sheriff broadened his search across the region, looking for other unexplained deaths that might be tied to Isaac. What emerged was a grim pattern. Isaac's presence on a plantation was often followed by sudden, inexplicable deaths among the enslaved. In Chesterfield County, records revealed that he had briefly belonged to Benjamin Curthers in 1843. Curthers had owned Isaac for only 3 months before selling him to Crawford, citing unacceptable behavior. pressed by Hawthorne Curthers, admitted that during those months, several of his strongest and most valuable workers had died unexpectedly. Each case mirrored the pattern later seen at Crawford's estate. The victims appeared to have passed peacefully in their sleep, but closer examination revealed the same small puncture wound behind the ear. What convinced Curthers that Isaac was responsible was not only the timing of the deaths, but Isaac's reaction. While others mourned, Isaac lingered over the bodies with unsettling fascination. He studied them, touched them, turned them as if they were puzzles to be solved, showing none of the reverence expected in such moments. To Curthers, it was as if Isaac were conducting an examination rather than witnessing the loss of human lives. By the time Isaac arrived at Peaton Grove, he had already left behind a trail of death across at least 2 plantations. He had moved through Virginia, not as an ordinary laborer, but as something far more dangerous, a predator hidden in plain sight, perfecting his craft with patience, precision, and the cold detachment of a surgeon. Curthers' worst fears about Isaac had been confirmed the night he caught him in the slave quarters, standing over the body of a woman who had died only hours earlier. In his hand was a thin, pointed instrument, unlike any tool used in farm work. When challenged, Isaac did not deny what he was doing. Instead, he calmly explained that he was studying the effects of death on human tissue. The response so unnerved Curthers that he arranged Isaac's sale within days, eager to rid himself of the man, no matter the financial loss. As Sheriff Hawthorne gathered these accounts, a new sense of urgency gripped the investigation. If Isaac had left a trail of carefully hidden deaths across multiple plantations, his escape from Peaton Grove meant that a killer of extraordinary cunning was at large. Hawthorne contacted lawmen in surrounding counties, creating one of the earliest cooperative search efforts in Virginia. Still, Isaac remained a phantom, always suspected, never seen. The investigation took a startling turn when Dr. Jonathan Peaton, still reeling from the massacre of his family, was approached at his residence in Cumberland Courthouse by Samuel Woodson, a respected free black blacksmith from Farmville. Woodson claimed to know Isaac not as a slave, but as a free man who had once lived in Philadelphia. His testimony shattered the foundation of everything the sheriff and the doctor thought they knew. According to Woodson, Isaac had been born free under the name Isaac Thornton. He had once worked as an assistant to Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a Philadelphia physician and anatomist of considerable repute. Thornton's talents had first appeared as gifts, an unusual intelligence, a steady hand, and a fascination with surgical work. But over time, Woodson explained that fascination took a darker turn. Thornton's curiosity about anatomy grew into an obsession with what he called the artistic possibilities of the human form. Dr. Whitfield himself had caught Isaac conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers in the medical college's anatomy hall. These were not legitimate dissections for study, but bizarre manipulations of the dead experiments that served no medical purpose. When confronted, Isaac had shown no guilt or shame, only a chilling detachment. He explained to Whitfield that he was exploring how the body might be used as raw material for sculpture. Appalled, Whitfield dismissed him immediately and barred him from the college. Yet the trouble did not end there. Within weeks, corpses vanished from the anatomy lab. Soon after, 3 bodies of recently deceased Philadelphians were discovered in abandoned buildings, grotesquely posed in ways that suggested Thornton had staged them for some macabre display. Police sought him for questioning, but he disappeared before they could act. Woodson believed that during his flight from Philadelphia, Isaac was seized by slave catchers. Lacking papers to prove his free status, and with his mixed heritage making his background harder to verify, he was likely mistaken for an escaped slave and sold into bondage. This, Woodson argued, explained how a man with the education of a surgeon had suddenly appeared in Virginia as property. To Dr. Peaton, Woodson's account was both revelatory and terrifying. It explained Isaac's encyclopedic knowledge of anatomy, his steady hands, and his cold detachment. But it also recast him not as a victim of circumstance, nor as a man driven by vengeance, but as something far worse, a predator whose obsession with the human body had begun long before he ever set foot on Virginia soil. If Isaac had once been a man of science trained in anatomy and surgery, the years he spent enslaved may have twisted his academic fascination with death into something vengeful, personal, and grotesque. The massacre at Piton Grove bore all the signs of careful planning, not a chaotic outburst. Every detail, the poses, the precision, the absence of panic suggested a man carrying out not just murder, but a grand design of retribution. The urgency of the search escalated when new reports trickled in from across central Virginia. In Buckingham County, livestock were discovered slaughtered and laid out in bizarre patterns that served no earthly purpose. In Charlotte County, several enslaved workers were found dead in their quarters, each marked by the same tiny puncture wound behind the left ear that investigators now recognized as Isaac's signature. But the most chilling came from Nottoway County, where an entire planter family vanished without a trace. Their home was untouched, no signs of struggle, yet investigators uncovered chilling evidence that the family had been stalked, watched, and studied for weeks before their disappearance. Sheriff Hawthorne responded with relentless determination, sending search parties into forests, favelas, and abandoned barns, anywhere a man like Isaac could find tools and concealment. But the hunt was complicated by conflicting descriptions. Some swore he was tall and broad-shouldered, others claimed he was unremarkable, blending seamlessly into a crowd. His ability to shift his presence to shape himself into whatever form people least remembered made him a predator of uncommon skill. Meanwhile, Professor Aldrich's work on Isaac's journals revealed truths more disturbing than anything found in the fields. The early entries had been clinical detached observations. The later pages, however, descended into the language of obsession. Isaac referred to the Piton Grove killings not as vengeance, but as his final experiment, an attempt to explore what he described as the aesthetic possibilities of mass mortality. The sketches he left behind revealed his vision bodies arranged as though in scenes of theater, posed to capture what he saw as the hidden beauty of death. Most unsettling of all were the hints that Isaac was not alone. Scattered through his writings were cryptic references to disciples and fellow students of the art. Though vague, these passages suggested he had been in contact with others who shared his warped philosophy. Men who saw human remains not as sacred, but as material for artistic expression. It raised the possibility that Isaac was part of a network, a hidden brotherhood of death masquerading beneath the surface of ordinary society. And just when it seemed the horror at Piton Grove had reached its limit, the investigation uncovered a breakthrough from a source no one expected, one that would drag the story deeper into the shadows than anyone in Cumberland County had ever imagined. Father O'Sullivan, a wandering Irish priest who ministered to scattered Catholic families across Cumberland and its neighboring counties, became the unlikely bearer of the clue that unraveled Isaac's next move. While riding his monthly circuit between Cumberland Courthouse and Farmville, the priest had crossed paths with a small band of travelers posing as itinerant preachers. Their plain garb and pious claims did little to reassure him, for something in their manner felt wrong. Their leader especially stood apart, a tall figure with pale, penetrating eyes who steered their conversation not toward salvation, but toward death. O'Sullivan later recounted that the man spoke obsessively about the body's condition after death, the mechanics of decay, and the separation of soul from flesh. His knowledge of anatomy rivaled that of physicians the priest had met in Dublin, but his fascination was not medical. It was artistic. The man described visions in which he claimed to have been divinely commanded to shape living sculptures from human remains, insisting that his work would bring souls closer to perfection. What unsettled the priest most was not just the man's conviction, but his calm certainty that he was carrying out God's will. The priest's account left little doubt. The figure he described was Isaac, now traveling openly with companions he called disciples. Worse, they were heading toward Powhatan County to stage what they claimed would be a great revival meeting. Sheriff Hawthorne wasted no time dispatching riders to warn Powhatan authorities while he raised a pursuit party. Yet before Cumberland's men could even set out, word arrived that the horror had already struck. Colonel William Randolph of Powhatan had sent an urgent plea for help, describing an atrocity that dwarfed even the nightmare at Peaton Grove. When lawmen reached the Randolph estate, a mansion that had stood since the 1600s, they found it transformed into a grotesque gallery. In the grand parlor, 17 members of the Randolph family were seated around their dining table in perfect order, their bodies posed as though attending a lavish meal. But each head had been severed and placed carefully on china plates before them, a banquet of death arranged with chilling artistry. Candlelight flickered across the room, throwing shadows that gave the impression of merriment, as if the family were frozen in the act of feasting together beyond the grave. The horror deepened in the ballroom. Their 32 enslaved men and women from the plantation had been arranged in lifelike dancing poses. Their bodies, stripped and manipulated, were paired with the severed heads of the Randolph family, creating a grotesque masquerade of social equality that the real world of Virginia would never permit. The scene was part parody, part proclamation, a perverse vision of integration, staged through slaughter. To the investigators who entered that house, it was unmistakable. Isaac had not only killed again, he had escalated, turning his obsession into theater. Peaton Grove had been his experiment. The Randolph estate was his masterpiece. And somewhere out in the dark countryside of Virginia, Isaac was still free. The horror inside the Randolph plantation was not the work of a single frenzied night, but of days spent in deliberate, methodical labor. Dr. Jonathan Peaton, serving as both physician and reluctant witness, quickly realized that Isaac had not acted alone. The scale and precision of the arrangements, combined with Father O'Sullivan's testimony about the traveling preachers, left no doubt Isaac had disciples now, and together they were perfecting his grim craft. What separated Randolph from Peaton Grove was the refinement of cruelty. At Peaton Grove, death had been swift and clinical. One cut, one moment, life extinguished. But at Randolph, many victims showed signs they had been kept alive for parts of their ordeal. Isaac and his followers had begun experimenting not only with the arrangement of death, but with the process of dying itself. In the plantation's root cellar, investigators discovered the true heart of Isaac's evolving method. The chamber had been remade into a field laboratory, surgical tools carefully laid out, anatomical charts pinned to the walls, and notebooks filled with sketches that charted human suffering, as though it were a science. Most horrifying were the wooden restraints built with a carpenter's precision, designed to hold men and women immobile while procedures were performed. These procedures, Dr. Peaton's reading revealed, had no medical purpose at all. They were cruel experiments to measure how long a body could cling to awareness, how much pain a mind could endure before collapsing into silence. The notes made clear that Isaac was no longer content with killing. He wanted to watch, to document, to turn agony into data. His writings dwelled on consciousness, as though it were a material to be stretched and broken. He wanted to preserve the instant between life and death, to treat it as part of his art. But the laboratory held something more urgent than horrors of the past. Past, it carried warnings of the future. Fresh supplies had been delivered within the last 2 days, including unused surgical instruments. On a table lay maps of plantations across Powhatan and Cumberland counties, annotated with guard rotations, family habits, and architectural details. Each was marked with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Worse still was a timeline written in Isaac's own hand. It laid out attacks stretching through the summer of 1847, each massacre envisioned as a chapter in what he called his treatise on the aesthetics of mortality. To Isaac, these killings were no longer isolated events, but installments of a single monstrous work. According to the timeline, his next target was the Carrington plantation in Cumberland County, less than 10 miles from where the sheriff now stood. The attack was scheduled for the following evening, set to coincide with a dinner party when the maximum number of victims would be gathered under one roof. Sheriff Hawthorne wasted no time. He dispatched riders to warn the Carrington family and summoned every available lawman from 5 surrounding counties. What followed was the largest manhunt Virginia had ever seen. Officers combed the countryside, dogs were set loose on Isaac's trail, but the fugitive proved elusive. Evidence suggested he knew the very biology of his pursuers. Reports indicated he used chemical substances to mask his scent, sending the hounds in circles along false trails. By nightfall, with Isaac still at large, Hawthorne made a fateful decision. The Carrington dinner would proceed, but under heavy guard. Armed men were stationed throughout the house and grounds, hidden in shadows, ready to spring the trap. The plantation itself would serve as bait, a final gamble to stop Isaac before he could carve the next chapter of his grotesque masterpiece. Colonel James Carrington, hardened by his years of military service, insisted that the household carry on as if nothing had been discovered. To tip Isaac off, he argued, would guarantee disaster. So the dinner went forward, 12 guests and family members at the long, polished table, while nearly 30 armed officers concealed themselves in the shadows of the property, waiting for the trap to spring. But Isaac was already 2 steps ahead. He did not come across the fields or through the windows as the lawmen expected. Instead, he and his disciples had spent days tunneling beneath the Carrington grounds, carving a hidden passageway that led directly into the heart of the house. The first warning came from Mrs. Elizabeth Carrington, who remarked uneasily about a scratching sound beneath the floorboards. Seconds later, sections of the dining room planks splintered open, and 4 figures clawed their way into the room like predators breaching from the earth. Isaac was almost unrecognizable. His once controlled appearance had unraveled hair-wild clothing smeared with stains no one dared identify. Yet it was his face that struck terror into those who saw him. Gone was the cold detachment described in earlier reports. In its place was a rapture that bordered on religious ecstasy. His eyes gleamed as though lit from within, and every gesture radiated the conviction that he was carrying out holy work. His 3 disciples mirrored his transformation. 2 appeared to be formerly enslaved men who had thrown their lot in with him. And the third, startlingly, was quite likely a disaffected overseer or farmer, drawn into Isaac's warped creed. Together they moved with precision, every action rehearsed, every role defined. This attack bore little resemblance to Isaac's earlier massacres. At Peaton Grove and Randolph, the deaths had been swift, the knife strokes clean and final. But in the Carrington dining room, Isaac sought something different, terror as theater. The confined space, crowded with guests, made it impossible for hidden lawmen to intervene without endangering innocence. Gunfire in that room would have cut down captives as quickly as attackers. So the officers outside waited helplessly, listening as the scene inside descended into nightmare. For nearly 2 hours, Isaac held court. He moved with the authority of a conductor leading an orchestra, directing his disciples as they positioned victims like actors on a stage. His voice carried calm assurance as he forced the guests into a grotesque lesson. He lectured them on mortality, on the relationship between body and soul, on death as the only true medium of artistic permanence. To him, the human form was not sacred. It was clay to be molded, flesh to be arranged. Witnesses later described his performance as a kind of sermon crossed with an anatomy lecture. He spoke of beauty hidden in stillness, of the way lifeless bodies could capture grace more perfectly than any painting or sculpture. He forced the captives to examine the corpses of 2 guests he had already killed, pointing out what he called the aesthetic qualities of their final poses. Every detail, the angle of a hand, the tilt of a head was explained with the pride of an artist unveiling his work. From his concealed vantage outside the window, Dr. Jonathan Peaton watched with a mixture of dread and clinical fascination. He saw clearly that Isaac was no longer simply a murderer. He had built a philosophy, a twisted framework of ideas that transformed butchery into what he believed was art. This was no longer vengeance or madness in isolation. This was doctrine. And to Isaac, the Carrington dining room was not a crime scene. It was his cathedral. The turning point came when Colonel James Carrington calm, even under the threat of Isaac's madness, drew on his battlefield instincts. With subtle prearranged signals, the placement of his hands upon the dining table, he indicated to the concealed officers that Isaac and his disciples had shifted into a position vulnerable to crossfire. At once the lawmen struck. The windows shattered as gunfire erupted from 3 directions. Isaac, in the midst of demonstrating the mechanics of his art to a trembling Mrs. Carrington, had no chance to move. Multiple rounds tore through his chest, dropping him instantly. His disciples tried to seize their hostages as shields, but the careful positioning of the ambush left them no room. Within seconds, the carnage ended, and 4 bodies sprawled lifeless across the dining room floor, their blood soaking into the carpet alongside the victims they had staged like grotesque ornaments. The tableau that Isaac had so meticulously crafted became in his death a ruin of chaos. Yet killing Isaac did not erase his legacy. In the weeks that followed, investigators sifted through the wreckage of his laboratories and journals. What they found tied him to suspicious deaths across 6 counties over the previous 4 years. Even conservative estimates placed his toll at more than 100 lives, elevating him from a local terror to one of the most prolific killers in American history. Worse still were the correspondences. Hidden among Isaac's notes were letters from sympathizers across the North Carolina, Georgia men and women who spoke admiringly of his philosophy and sought to replicate his methods. Isaac's twisted creed, which elevated slaughter into art, had not been his alone. He had sown seeds of discipleship, and some of those seeds had taken root. Arrests followed in 1848, but many slipped away into the shadows of the Western Territories, spreading whispers of his doctrine beyond Virginia's borders. The terror Isaac unleashed did not end with his death. Plantation owners across Virginia, shaken to their core, tightened security as never before. The mere thought that an enslaved man, or worse, a free ally, might harbor Isaac's ideas fractured the already fragile social fabric of the South. Suspicion seeped into every interaction between master and slave, neighbor and stranger. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation was that Isaac's philosophy resonated with more than just the discontented enslaved. Free men, too, had been drawn to his doctrine, captivated by his claim that death itself could be a medium of creation. His writings contained letters praising his work, requesting instruction, even pledging loyalty to his aesthetic vision. When the official investigation concluded, Virginia authorities sealed their report under strict classification. It would not be uncovered until after the Civil War, when the old order had collapsed and the secrets of antebellum society spilled into daylight. That final report admitted a truth that haunted every line of testimony. Isaac's real identity, despite all efforts, remained uncertain. Whether he had truly been Isaac Thornton of Philadelphia or someone else entirely was never proven. What remained beyond dispute was the terror he left behind, a philosophy of death that had scarred the South long after the man himself was gone. Samuel Woodson's testimony gave investigators their only lead on Isaac's possible past. Yet it ultimately unraveled into more questions than answers. No record of an Isaac Thornton fitting Woodson's description could be found in Philadelphia or anywhere in Pennsylvania. That absence led to troubling speculation. Perhaps Isaac had once been a free man of education who deliberately entered slavery as cover for his obsessions, seeking both anonymity and a steady supply of victims. Or, as others suggested, he might have been of mixed racial heritage, able to pass as enslaved when it suited him and move undetected across social boundaries when it did not. What remained undeniable was the sophistication of his mind. Isaac displayed knowledge of medicine, anatomy, and psychology far beyond what enslaved men were believed capable of accessing in antebellum Virginia. He manipulated entire households, anticipating their routines and exploiting their vulnerabilities with chilling precision. This level of discipline suggested not mere cunning, but formal education. The report's most alarming conclusion was that Isaac might not have been unique. His letters hinted at others men scattered across the slave-holding South who cloaked their obsessions within the plantation system, where human lives could be controlled, hidden, and destroyed with little scrutiny. Investigators warned that Isaac's philosophy might already be spreading, carried by disciples or imitators who viewed death not as tragedy, but as raw material for expression. They urged state and local authorities to coordinate surveillance, fearing his methods could take root elsewhere. The legacy of Isaac's crimes left Virginia shaken for decades. He had exposed vulnerabilities no planter wished to acknowledge. His campaign proved that enslaved men and women could possess intelligence and discipline equal to or greater than their masters, a reality that destabilized the myth of white control. More unsettling still, his ability to assume new identities and move between plantations revealed cracks in the very system of slavery itself. The informal trade of human beings with little documentation or oversight gave predators like Isaac space to operate invisibly. In the end, Isaac was not a phantom or a supernatural force. His horror lay in the cold application of intellect to cruelty. His campaign showed that evil does not require chaos, it thrives in order, planning, and patience. He was proof that the most monstrous acts are often carried out not in frenzy but in calculated calm. And that is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Peyton Grove and Randolph massacres, that beneath the facade of civility, systems of power can conceal the darkest impulses of the human mind. Isaac's story reminds us that history's greatest monsters often present themselves not as madmen, but as rational men with steady hands and twisted purpose. So what do you think? Was everything truly revealed about Isaac's identity and motives? Or do you believe more remains hidden in those sealed reports? Leave your thoughts in the comments and tell me which historical mysteries from your region deserve to be uncovered next. If you found this tale chilling, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. The past hides many secrets, secrets powerful people once tried to bury. Together, we'll keep digging them up. See you in the next video.